The fix is complicated because our Constitution is extremely hard to amend. You know, if you could start all over again, I think I would actually shift from a presidential to a parliamentary system because I just think they work better. Usually Americans don't like to think about other democracies because we think our democracy is perfect and we're not going to learn anything from, you know, Canada or, you know, Germany or anything. But in fact, you know, I think in a lot of domains, other countries do things better. And by the way, even today, compared to a European government where if you have a changeover in administrations in a typical parliamentary democracy in Europe, the minister and maybe the vice minister in each cabinet department will change. So a total of maybe a couple dozen people will turn over when an administration changes. In the United States, we still change about 4,000 or 5,000 positions every time the Republicans replace the Democrats or vice versa in the White House. So we still have a pretty high level of old-fashioned political patronage. So I think I would draw the following lessons from that story, which is that, first of all, in a certain way, living in a patronage-filled, corrupt political system is not unusual. It's not a pathological condition. I think it's actually a normal condition, and it's particularly a normal condition for young democracies. And you actually have to take very special measures to get out of this situation. And the way that you get out of it is essentially political. So in a way, democracy was what created the problem. You know, how do you get voters motivated to vote for you? But democracy, it turned out, was also the solution, because by the 1880s, enough Americans had joined the middle class. You know, they were more educated, they had more wealth, they were more interested in having a high-quality government. They were really quite sick of having these political hacks, you know, running all of their local political institutions. And so there's a kind of groundswell during the Progressive era for this kind of change. And there's also very good leadership, you know, from people like Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, who, you know, in fact, Roosevelt was one of the first chairman of the U.S. Civil Service Commission. Was very interested in having a high-quality government. Woodrow Wilson was actually a professor of public administration at Johns Hopkins before he became president, or went on to be president of Princeton and then president of the United States. So this, I think, indicates that, you know, the fracture line in the world and the really difficult challenge is, in a certain sense, less getting to a democracy than getting to a modern democracy, getting to an effective modern state. That's a harder transition. It's a transition that I called the problem of getting to Denmark. And so Denmark, I don't mean the actual country Denmark necessarily. Denmark's kind of a symbol for a country that's rich, democratic, stable, and has vanishingly low levels of corruption. You know, there's all these international indicators that try to measure levels of corruption. Denmark, you know, Singapore, Norway, they almost always end up at the top of the league tables in regard to this. And, you know, the United States in its foreign policy has wanted to try to create little Denmarks all over the place in Haiti, Somalia, Afghanistan, the Congo, and we don't get anywhere close to this. You know, it would actually be nice to turn them into Indonesia or something, but we can't even really get to that point. And so it's a very tough problem, and the question is, how did any country make that transition from a patrimonial or a neo-patrimonial system to a modern system? So that's the point I'm going to try to now illustrate by reference to American history, because this happened in the United States in the 19th century, and I think that Americans don't understand, you know, the way their own institutions develop, because when they look at a Mexico or India, Brazil, you know, any one of these developing countries that has a lot of corruption, a lot of political patronage, clientelism, and so forth, they say, you know, these people don't know what they're doing, they don't understand what a modern government is supposed to look like, you know, how could they be that ignorant? And I think the issue is that it's not a matter of ignorance. It's, I think, a kind of natural evolution in early democracies. And I think the single proof of this is the history of the United States itself. So I'm sure a lot of you teach American history, but if I can give my own canned history of the development of bureaucracy in the United States, it would go something like this. So if you ask the question, who ran the U.S. government in the early days after the Revolution, you could say it was kind of the friends of George Washington, meaning, first of all, the federal government was very, very small at that time. They had some customs inspectors, they had a post office at a national level, they had not even a standing army, they just had state militias. There was a navy. That was about it. So the revenue needs were very, very small, and most of the government was staffed by elites at that time. That's what I mean by the friends of George Washington, meaning a lot of them were graduates of Harvard, Yale, Princeton. They all came from either the planter class in Virginia or the merchant gentry class in New England. That is a situation that persisted really up until the 1820s. In the 1820s, America started to really democratize. So as you're aware, there are all of these qualifications, property qualifications on the franchise in the early days in the United States. And by the late 1820s, basically, most states had dropped them so that all white males could vote. So you still didn't have women's suffrage, or certainly African Americans were still slaves, but all of a sudden, all white men could vote. And the first major election that was affected by this opening of the franchise was the election of 1828, which brought Andrew Jackson to power. So Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams. And in a way, this is a classic pairing in American politics, which exists up until the 2016 election. John Quincy Adams was a Boston Brahmin. He was the son of John Adams, the second president of the United States. He had been educated at Harvard. He traveled in Europe as a young man. He could speak foreign languages, very well-educated, cosmopolitan guy. Andrew Jackson was a frontiersman from rural Tennessee. He probably didn't even have a high school education. He was a brawler, a drinker, Scotch-Irish, backwoodsman. But he was also a very successful military leader. He, in a couple of very brutal campaigns, against the Cherokees and the Seminoles, essentially drove them out of their territories, and then he ended up as the victor in the Battle of New Orleans against the British during the War of 1812, which is what propelled him onto a national stage. So he wins the, so just if you keep in your mind these two gentlemen running against each other, John Quincy Adams is like the John Kerry, of his day. John Kerry went to Yale, and he can speak French, and, comes from a rather privileged background. And, essentially, Jackson is not, he's more like Sarah Palin than Donald Trump, in that Donald Trump himself, came from a very privileged background. So, but, Jackson was a populist. He was the first American populist, and he mobilized a lot of popular anger against Northeastern elites, all these Harvard and Yale educated people like John Quincy Adams that had been running the American government up to that point. And because the franchise had expanded, there were a lot of new voters that had never voted in their lives. Most of them didn't have, much more than about a fourth grade education. And these were the people that supported him. He, just like Ron Paul, he didn't like, the idea of a national bank, which had been Alexander Hamilton's pet project, to have a Bank of the United States. So he basically undermined that. So it's kind of like distrusting the Federal Reserve today. And when he was elected in 1828, he said two things. He said, first of all, I won the election, so I should choose who runs the American government. And secondly, I'm paraphrasing now, he said, it doesn't take a genius to run the American government. Any ordinary American can do it. And so this inaugurates this period in American history known as the patronage or the spoils system, in which virtually every office in the American government, from the federal government all the way down to your local fourth-class postmaster, is put there as a result of a payoff from a politician to a political supporter, right? And so essentially, once the system gets going, every time the Republicans replace the Democrats or vice versa in, your local state legislature, every postmaster is fired and replaced by a postmaster with allegiance to the other party that just won the election. And then in, eastern and southern American cities, you have these big city machines in Boston, Chicago, New York, Tammany Hall, all of which operate according to this patronage principle that basically I give you an individual benefit like a Christmas turkey or a job on the police force in return for your voting for me, on election day. It is no different from what goes on in India, Brazil, Mexico, any number of developing countries today. And this is what makes me think that if you call this corruption, and it did lead to a substantial amount of corruption, but if you call this corruption, I would say that in that case, corruption, I think, is a kind of natural stage in the early development of democracies. Because why did this happen in the United States? Well, founding fathers, as you, I'm sure, are well aware, did not imagine the need for political parties. But the moment you opened up the franchise and you had to get thousands of people out to the polling place, you needed an organization that could mobilize voters. So that's the origin of a political party. And then how do you get poorly educated and not very wealthy voters to go out and vote on election day? Well, you don't do it by saying, we need to change our policy towards the British-French alliance, or something like that. You do it by saying, I'll give you a job, I'll give you a bottle of brandy or something, if you vote for me. And I think this is the process that goes on in, poor democracies today, that you need to mobilize a lot of voters, and the easiest way to do it is essentially by bribing them individually. All right? So by the time you get to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, if you read his letters, especially when he's reelected in 1864, he's just inundated with office seekers, and it's just a plague. He has to spend the first 6 months of his term meeting with individuals who supported him during the election campaign, and they think they deserve, a government position. So the United States is very similar to many contemporary, young democracies in the developing world. How did this end, or how did we get out of this? This all began to change in the 1880s. So in the 1880s, the United States is going through this very large socioeconomic transition. At that point, the leading technology, the internet of that day, is the railroads. Railroads are tying the United States together in a big national market. So all of these isolated farm communities in Iowa and Kansas can all of a sudden ship all their grain to Chicago and then put it on a boat and send it to Europe, right? So the scale of the economy expands tremendously, and the country begins to urbanize and industrialize. A lot of people begin to feel that this old kind of incompetent patronage-based governmental system isn't serving them terribly well, but they cannot bring about political change. Why? So what are the incentives of members of Congress at this point? So there was something called the Pendleton Act that was proposed by a congressman named George Pendleton to create a modern civil service that was not patronage-based. If you're a member of Congress in the year 1882 or 3, what are your incentives? Would you support something like the Pendleton Act? Well, think about it. How did all these guys get elected in the first place? By patronage, right? So they have zero incentive to vote for a system that they got them into office and they manipulated. So this is another truth about political reform, is that political reform fails not because people don't understand that there's a better system out there. It fails because all of the incumbent power holders don't want it to succeed, because they profit from the current system, right? So Pendleton Act's proposed, and it doesn't go anywhere. So the only reason that something happens is in 1882, James Garfield is elected president. He is shot by a would-be office seeker, this guy named Charles Guiteau, that thought he should be appointed the consul, U.S. consul to France. He doesn't get the job. He gets pissed off, shoots the president. Garfield takes about 6 weeks to die, this very painful death. And then all of a sudden there's this big uproar about patronage, because here the president had been assassinated by a patronage seeker. And so even the outgoing Congress is embarrassed into actually voting for the Pendleton Act. And then a new Congress is elected in 1884 that shifts the balance into people that actually, now want reform. And so what does the Pendleton Act do? It establishes the principle that you should get a job in the federal government if you pass a civil service examination. And you should be promoted on the basis of technical knowledge and merit, and not because of your political connections. But the rearguard action of the two political parties is such that they only permit an extension of classified employment when their party loses, and they want to protect all of their political appointees, that are already in the government. So they say, all right, well, their positions can be classified, and after they die, you can appoint them with someone qualified. But and so it takes another 40 years until, majority of positions in the U.S. government are classified positions as opposed to patronage positions.